Free will. Because of God's omniscience, most probably, Augustine recognized that the metaphysical unreality of evil and the supposition of deficient causes were inadequate to dispose of the difficulties. Accordingly, he added a theory of free will. From pagan antiquity through the Middle Ages on down into modern times, free will has doubtless been the most popular solution offered for the problem of evil. God is all-powerful, many people will say, but he has adopted a hands-off policy and allows men to act apart from divine influence. We choose, and we choose evil of our own free wills. God does not make us do so, therefore, we alone are responsible and not God. This theory of free will must now be carefully examined. Is it a satisfactory theory? Do its proponents have an unambiguous concept of its chief term? Is it true that the will is free? And if it is true, does free will solve the problem of evil? Augustine's formulation of the theory of free will, like many other of his views, did not remain unaltered. In his pagan life, he had been a Manichaean. He had accepted an ultimate dualism of good and evil. After his conversion, although he had a brilliant mind, he did not immediately see the implications of the biblical assertions so clearly as he did later in life. It took time, even for Augustine, to develop. His early view of free will seems to be that all men are completely untrammeled in their decisions. Anyone can as easily choose this as that. Neither divine grace nor any other force determines a man in either direction. In his work on free will, he begins by wondering how it is possible for all souls, seeing that they commit sin, to have come from God without referring those sins back to God. In other words, if God created souls which are now sinful, is not God responsible for sin? And to go further, quote, I ask whether a free will itself, by which we are proved to have a power to sin, should have been given us by him who made us. For it is clear that if we were without free will, we would not sin. And in this way, it is to be feared that God may be adjudged the author of our evil doing. End quote. To avoid this conclusion, the explanation, or at least a part of it, is that without free will, we could as little do good as evil. A being, such as a stone, or perhaps a bug, that cannot do evil, is equally incapable of doing good. The ability to do good or evil is one, and God is not to blame if man uses his freedom wrongly. Free will may indeed do wrong, but there is no right action without free will. Even sin does not justify the assertion that it were better if sinners did not exist. There must be all grades of being in the world. Variety is essential. Even a soul that perseveres in sin is better than any inanimate body that cannot sin because it has no will. One must pause, however. From the metaphysical assumption that being is better than non-being, does it follow that a sinner is better off than a stone? What would Augustine have said if he had remembered Christ's statement? Quote, it would have been good for that man if he had not been born. End quote. This statement Christ made was, of course, referring to Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. Such questions come to mind, but the exposition of Augustine's views must continue. So far, it would seem that free will is the property of all men. The very possibility of doing either good or evil requires it. But toward the end of the book, Augustine introduces a thought which he expands in his later writings. Noting that men now inevitably sin and cannot avoid it, he says, quote, "When we speak, then, of the free will to do right, we speak of the will in which man first was made." End quote. Thus it appears that no one now has a free will. In his work, The City of God, Augustine makes this point clearer. Adam had free will in the sense that he was able not to sin. This presumably is the popular notion of free will. Most people seem to mean by it that a man is just as able to will one thing as its opposite. He is free, they say, because he can choose to obey or to disobey God's commands. But by the time that Augustine wrote The City of God, he had learned enough about the Bible, and about men too, to know that in this age it is impossible for anyone not to sin. Sin is inevitable. Therefore, the ability to do good or evil is not one. Though the unregenerate do evil, they cannot do good. In the future, when our redemption shall have been completed and we are glorified in heaven, another impossibility will appear. There we shall be unable to sin. Again, the ability to do good or evil is not one, for though we shall do good, we shall not be able to do evil. There are thus 3 stages in the total human drama. Before the fall, where it's possible not to sin. And the second stage is in the world to come, where it is not possible to sin. But in the third stage, in this present world, it's not possible not to sin. Adam, therefore, was the only man who ever had free will in the usual sense of the term. The phrase free will, however, had such attractive connotations that Augustine did not wish to limit it to Adam. Hence, he immediately continues, "Is God himself in truth to be denied free will because he cannot sin?" Excellent question. Augustine assumes that everyone will want to call God free. One may ask the same question also about the righteous angels. But if God and the angels have free will must be redefined so as to consist with a denial that 2 incompatible actions are equally possible. Free will must be made consistent with inevitability and therefore will no longer bear its common meaning. Later writers also have made a point of the fixed and determined felicity of the future state, and it might be worth a parenthetical paragraph to pause for a reference to the Puritan John Gill. In his work, The Cause of God and Truth, he writes, quote, "God is a most free agent, and liberty in him is in its utmost perfection, and yet does not lie in an indifference to good and evil. He has no freedom to that which is evil. His will is determined only to that which is good. He can do no other. And what he does freely and yet necessarily. The human nature of Christ, or the man Christ Jesus, who, as he was born without sin and lived without it all his days on earth, so was impeccable, could not sin. He lay under some kind of necessity to fulfill all righteousness, and yet he did it most freely and voluntarily, which proves that the liberty of man's will is consistent with some kind of necessity. The good angels, holy and elect, who are confirmed in the state in which they are, cannot sin or fall from that happy state, yet perform their whole obedience to God. They do his will and work cheerfully and willingly. In the state of glorification, the saints will be impeccable, cannot sin, can only do that which is good, and yet what they do or will do is and will be done with the utmost freedom and liberty of their wills, whence it follows that the liberty of man's will is consistent both with some kind of necessity and a determination to one. End quote. This effectively disposes of Augustine's early contention that one must be able to sin in order to do anything good. It also leaves free will in a dubious condition. In this material from Augustine and John Gill, two important points emerge. The first is that the Bible does not teach the equal possibility of two incompatible choices. Even if some perverse misinterpreter should still contend that the ability to do good or evil is one, the meaning of the denial is plain and unambiguous. The second point that emerges from the preceding discussion is, however, a matter of ambiguity. Free will has been defined as the equal ability, under given circumstances, to choose either of two courses of action. No antecedent power determines the choice. Whatever motives or inclinations a man may have, or whatever inducements may be laid before him that might seem to turn him in a certain direction, he may at a moment disregard them all and do the opposite. This definition or description, however, is what the present writer believes to be the common notion of free will. This is not the definition found in Augustine or John Gill. Indeed, these two writers do not give a formal definition of free will. Strange though it may seem to a logician, many writers do not define their terms with great care, and the reader is unfortunately left to guess at the meaning. An Arminian reading John Gill's The Cause of God and Truth might very well wonder what its author could possibly mean by liberty and freedom. Nor would his perplexity be entirely unjustified. The Puritan speaks of a will that is both free and determined. He refers to actions that are done freely yet necessarily. And he concludes that the liberty of a man's will is consistent with at least some kind of necessity and determination. But the Arminian reader feels himself almost necessitated to judge that this makes no sense. Are not necessity and freedom incompatible? Is it remotely possible that both could be attributed to the same action, choice, or will? The explanation, of course, lies in the fact that the Arminian has a different notion of freedom from that of John Gill. And perhaps he is unaware that in the history of philosophy, freedom of choice has been defined in several different ways. One should never suppose that a phrase or a term means the same thing in every book in which it occurs. Each author chooses the meaning he desires, and each reader ought to try to determine what that meaning is. To be sure, the author ought not to try to make this task difficult, and Gill and others of his day should have said more clearly what they meant. Strict definitions and strict adherence to them are essential to intelligible discussion. If one contender has one idea in mind, or perhaps no clear idea at all, while the other party to the debate entertains a different notion or is equally vague, the result of the conversation is bound to be complete confusion. This is the elementary lesson that Socrates taught in the 5th century before Christ, but many people have not learned it yet. In accord with common opinion, the phrase free will shall here henceforth be used to indicate the theory that a man faced with incompatible courses of action is as able to choose any one as well as any other. It may be necessary in quoting previous authors to use the phrase in another sense, if they so used it. But the argument of this chapter will restrict the phrase free will to the above definition. This is done in the belief that no Arminian will object. He can make no accusation that his case is prejudged to a surreptitious introduction of a Calvinistic element into the chief term. Free will is defined with all the freedom that any Arminian could desire. It might seem that here is the proper place to ask the question: does man have a free will? Is it true that his choices are not determined by motives, by inducements, or by his settled character? Can a person resist God's grace and power and make an uncaused decision? However, these questions will not be answered here. They will be discussed later. The next step in the argument is a slightly different one. Let us assume that man's will is free. Let us assume that these questions have been answered in the affirmative. It would still remain to be shown that free will solves the problem of evil. This, then, is the immediate inquiry. Is the theory of free will, even if true, a satisfactory explanation of evil in a world created by God? Reasons. Compelling reasons will now be given for a negative answer. Even if men were as able to choose good as evil, even if a sinner could choose Christ as easily as he could reject Christ, it would be totally irrelevant to the fundamental problem. Free will was put forward to relieve God of responsibility for sin, but this it does not do. Suppose there were a lifeguard stationed on a dangerous beach. In the breakers, a boy is being sucked out to sea by the strong undertow. He cannot swim. This poor boy will drown without powerful aid. And it will have to be powerful, for as drowning sinners do, he will struggle against his rescuer. But the lifeguard simply sits on his high chair and watches him drown. Perhaps he may shout a few words of advice. Perhaps he may shout a few words telling him, encouraging him to exercise his free will. After all, it was of his own free will that the boy went into the surf in the first place. The guard merely permitted him to go in and permitted him to drown. Would an Arminian now conclude that the lifeguard thus escapes culpability? This illustration, with its finite limitations, is damaging enough as it is. It shows that permission of evil, as contrasted with positive causality, does not relieve a lifeguard from responsibility. Similarly, if God merely permits men to be engulfed in sin of their own free wills, the original objections of Voltaire and Professor Patterson are not thereby met. This is what the Arminian fails to notice, and yet the illustration does not do full justice to the actual situation. For unlike the boy who exists in relative independence of the lifeguard, in actuality, God created not only the boy, but created the ocean as well. Now, if the lifeguard, who is not a creator at all, is responsible for permitting the boy to drown, even if the boy is supposed to have entered the surf of his own free will, does not God, who made them all, appear in an even worse light? Surely an omnipotent God could have either made the boy a better swimmer, or made the ocean less rough, or at least God could have saved him from drowning. Not only are free will and permission irrelevant to the problem of evil, but further, the idea of permission has no intelligible meaning. It is quite within the range of possibility for a lifeguard to permit a man to drown. This permission, however, depends on the fact that the ocean's undertow is beyond the guard's control. If the guard had some giant suction device which he operated so as to engulf the boy, one would call it murder, not permission. The idea of permission is possible only when there is an independent force, either the boy's force or the ocean's force. But this is not the situation in the case of God. This is not the situation in the case of the universe. Nothing in the universe can be independent of the omnipotent Creator. For in Him we live and move and have our being. Therefore, the idea of permission makes no sense when applied to God. Such subterfuges must in all honesty be renounced. Consider two quotations from Calvin's Institutes, Book 3. Quote, "Here they recur to the distinction between will and permission, and insist that God permits the destruction of the impious, but does not will it. But what reason shall we assign for his permitting it, but because it is his will? It is not probable, however, that man procured his own destruction by the mere permission without any appointment of God, as though God had not determined what he would choose to be the condition of the principle of his creatures. I shall not hesitate, therefore, to confess plainly with Augustine that the will of God is the necessity of things, and that what he has willed will necessarily come to pass. God is very frequently said to blind and harden the reprobate, and to turn, to incline, to influence their hearts, as I have elsewhere more fully stated. But it affords no explication of the nature of this influence to resort to prescience or permission. For the execution of his judgments, he, by means of Satan, the minister of his wrath, directs their counsels to what he pleases, and excites their wills and strengthens their efforts. Thus, when Moses relates that Sihon the king would not grant a free passage to the people because God had, quote, hardened his spirit and made his heart obstinate, end quote, he immediately subjoins the end of God's design, quote, that he might deliver him into thy hand, end quote. Since God willed his destruction, the obduration of his heart, therefore, was the divine preparation for his ruin, end quote. Thus the futility of free will is established. Some other theory must be sought, and in the production of that theory, it will become evident that free will is not only futile, but false. Certainly, if the Bible is the Word of God, free will is false, for the Bible consistently denies free will. Therefore, the attempt will now be made to explain evil on the basis of historic Protestantism.